Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. Anybody who's been paying attention to the show knows it's a little bit of a dynamic time in Alberta politics. There's some excitement going on. To try to do a little bit of a temperature check, maybe make some sense of a few things that otherwise are bewildering, we're enlisting the help of a powerfully prescient prognosticator of provincial politics, and you better bet that I wrote that down so I wouldn't get it wrong. We are extremely excited to be joined by political scientist, U of C professor, Dr. Lisa Young. Dr. Young, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
So before we get into the why is everything on fire, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what your background is.
Sure. Okay. So I've been at University of Calgary for 25 years now. I came in 1997, and so I've spent most of my academic career here in Alberta. I'm originally from Winnipeg. I've spent time in Ontario, a little bit of time in BC. So but Alberta is home now after all this time. And for the last few years, I've been increasingly focused on Alberta politics because it's endlessly fascinating.
That's a very diplomatic way of saying things.
I want to start off with a nice, easy question that I'm sure won't cause any problems at all. Who would you say the most boring premier in living memory of Alberta was?
Oh, that's a great question. The most boring premier in living memory. I'm going to go with Ed Stelmach.
Okay, Steady Eddie.
Steady Eddie, and Ed Stelmach could talk, and you just feel calm because it wasn't a lively presentation. I can't really remember very much that Ed Stelmach did when he was premier. Nothing sticks out. So yeah, I'm going with steady Ed Stelmach.
Okay. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that would argue that when you aren't able to think of deeply controversial things that happened under somebody's tenure as premier, that's overall probably a good sign. You have to know what the next question is going to be. The least boring premier of living memory.
Now, you see, that one is in some ways harder because there are so many contenders. I mean, Ralph Klein in his day was absolutely lively in his own way. Although really by current standards, I'm not sure he could compete. Danielle Smith has packed a lot into 6 weeks or however long it's been, but I'm not sure I'm ready to pass judgment on her yet. The liveliest, I'm going to have to go with Alison Redford. She packed a lot of political controversy into her time in office, most of it, in her own caucus. But that is really, that is so essential to Alberta politics, right? The task of being premier, at least for Conservative premiers, is to keep your caucus together. And Alison Redford failed at that in a spectacular sort of way. And so I think, per days in office, she was maybe the liveliest we've had. Although I think Danielle Smith is going to give her a run for her money.
Okay, well, there we go. And this sort of leads to the broader theme of the conversation I was hoping to have with you today, which is it seems like, we go back to 2019. And we saw a change of government, and everybody was like, oh, a change of government. And I don't think I certainly wasn't prepared. I don't have your flowchart skills, but I certainly wasn't prepared for just how dynamic Alberta politics was going to get. Like, I remember Bill 1, the Essential Infrastructure Act coming in, and everybody was like, oh, wow, that's really bad. That's a huge government overreach. And you look at where we are now, and it's kind of tame by comparison. So there's a lot of people who are looking at Alberta politics and going, my God, how did it get to be so bad? So my first question is it so bad?
you know, I'm going to give you two answers that sort of contradict each other. I'm going to give you the pessimistic answer, and then I'm going to give you the optimistic answer. So the pessimistic answer is that, yeah, it's pretty bad. We have lived through 3.5, almost 4 years now of government that has been focused on politics, on driving an ideological agenda, and then increasingly on managing sort of internal dissension in caucus. And there has really been a feeling, and I think a justifiable feeling, that through much of this, the government wasn't governing for all Albertans, it was governing for some Albertans. And that's bad. In a democracy, what we really want is to have, an election where ideas clash, one side wins, and we accept that side has won, but that side then tries to govern in the best interests of the whole province. And we might not agree with everything that they do, but there isn't a sense of government vilifying its opposition and the people that didn't support it. And here I'm thinking back especially to the first year and a half of the Kenney government, where they talked about people in the public sector as being kind of burdens on society, not contributing, not being productive. And I think that was really a damaging message. And it's contributed to the polarization that we feel. And, there are times when I tuned in for a little bit of the first question period when the ledge came back a couple of weeks ago, and I had to just turn away because just the tenor of the conversation, was just so off-putting that you think, gosh, in the face of this, we are not well governed. And of course, the stakes have been so high through the pandemic, right? We've been poorly governed at a time when it was literally a life and death situation, right? So yeah, things are bad. But here's my optimistic message. Alberta is a functioning democracy, and that is a good thing. And when we started out, I said I've lived here for 25 years, and I'm not sure that I would have said in the first, 10, 15 years that Alberta was absolutely a functioning democracy. We had elections, they were free and fair, but we knew what the outcome was going to be. There wasn't a strong opposition. There was no sense that it was possible for parties to rotate in and out of office the way that you want to see in a functioning democracy. And so there are all kinds of pathologies that, crept down into civil society because we didn't have that transition of power from one party to another party. So having the NDP win in 2015, and then having a credible, functional opposition party from 2019 on, has really put us back in a place where governments can't be complacent. They can't assume that they'll win. They can't believe that they're entitled to govern because they know an election's coming and the outcome isn't a sure thing. Now, right now, that election feels like it is going to be, in some ways, an awful, sort of clash of not just ideas, but people who really dislike and distrust one another. And it's going to be hard to watch in some ways. But it's democracy functioning, and I think it has, this is putting Alberta onto a path to be a functioning two-party system where we've got two credible potential governing parties that take turns. And as a political scientist, I say 2 thumbs up for that.
Okay.
Now, I want to explore that idea of a functioning democracy a little bit, because one of the things that strikes me is there's always that idea of the consent of the governed, where in an election the losing side has to say, okay, you got us, you're in charge now. And it seems like we've almost seen a bit of an erosion of that, particularly over the last couple of years. There's no question in my mind that the pandemic contributed to that immensely. but we're one of, I think, 2 provinces that recently had borderline insurrections, double pun intended, by the way. Um, and it seems to me, and this is where I'm hoping you're going to make me feel better, that part of the function of a functioning democracy or a functioning government is probably a better way to say it, is you have to have that consent of the governed, and it is reliant on some level of satisfaction from the electorate or the voters. And it seems like with the increasing polarization that we're seeing, that level of satisfaction is decreasing, he said cautiously. And if that's the case, that seems to have some fairly dark potential outcomes, given that we already had like murders planned at the border and stuff. Am I wrong? It's going to get better, right? Not worse, right?
You can quote me on that. So I think there's a couple of things here. There's a concept. My colleague Melanie Thomas talks about this a lot, and she's got great wisdom around this. And it's an idea. It's sort of the idea of consent of the governed, but losers consent, right? That when your side loses, you accept the loss and you accept the legitimacy of the government that's in place, right? And one of the things that we saw after the 2015 election, when the NDP was elected, was that there was not losers' consent across the province entirely. There were, I think we all sort of made fun of some guy who misspelled coup d'etat, but was calling for a misspelled coup d'etat. But that was an idea that had currency in a segment of the population, right? That Alberta was, a place that could not be governed by New Democrats, that was outside the bounds of what was acceptable or legitimate, right? And, it came from, I think, the far right, it's fair to say. And I don't know this for a fact, but I think we can draw some lines between that idea and the idea that when you're angry at government, even a UCP government, you go to the border and you shut down traffic, or you take your truck to Ottawa and honk your horns all night long, right? And again, what we saw from the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa was no losers consent at the federal level. And so that's a real worry. And one of the things, I'm skipping ahead a little bit maybe in your questions, but one of the things that has me worried about the emphasis that the Smith government is putting on the Sovereignty Act and the question of Alberta's place in Confederation is that it taps into that absence of losers' consent at the federal level. Alberta, not all of Alberta, there's a segment of the Alberta population that doesn't accept the legitimacy of the Trudeau government federally, right? That they don't think that that's how Canada should be governed. So without their, if it's not the government that they pick, then it's not legitimate. So this is tapping into some pretty dangerous ideas. Now, we know it's not widespread, but it's also not just a tiny fringe that you can dismiss. Polling data tells us that 20% of Albertans think that we would be better off if we separated from Canada. And I mean, that's not necessarily all built into that, but it does sort of suggest that there's 1 in 10, 2 in 10 Albertans that really do see politics in this particular way. And they only consider government acceptable if it's government that looks like what they think is appropriate, right? And that means that it has to be conservative. It has to be a particular kind of conservative, that sort of populist, the basis. And there is a sense in all of this that the rest of us who live in the province aren't legitimate, right? That we're not the real Albertans. And there's a notion of who the real Albertans are, and a sense that they really ought to be allowed to call the shots. And that's not healthy in a democracy.
Lots to unpack there. So I'm gonna try to come from a little bit of a different angle. You talked about the Smith feeding into things, and there's no question, I think, although there's probably some people who would say that there is where Smith stands on things and stuff, but there doesn't seem to be any question that she doesn't have any concerns with leaning into and in many ways amplifying the ideas that are demonstrably false or that are demonstrably inaccurate. And I'm curious if you have any concerns. One of the views that a lot of people have of leadership is that it should most of the time be a moderating voice. It shouldn't be necessarily an inflammatory voice. But it seems that more often than not, I'm trying really hard to think of an example where Smith has been moderating, and I'm not coming up with anything. More often than not, Smith leans into what's the most outrageous thing that I can say. Does that have, are you concerned at all about the long-term impact of that? Because if it seems like in society, when we have these more radical views that get espoused, it's really, really quick to start that fire. But it takes a long time to put the fire out and then grow the grass back and get the animals to come back and all of that. Are you concerned about that?
Absolutely. And, I think we've seen what's happened south of the border, and it's a cautionary tale. There certainly was organized racism in the United States before Donald Trump was elected president, but he unleashed it as a political force. He made it legitimate to express these views that had, until that point, been seen as, shameful or something that you kept in secret or on the dark web. And, the next thing we know, we've got, a bunch of young men with tiki torches out protesting, right? And we've seen the violence that has come out of this, and we've seen it in Canada as well. We know that there are people who've tapped into this, and the shooter in a mosque in Quebec City, and other instances like that. So it matters. If we didn't know that before, we know now that it matters what people in positions of authority say. They define what's considered legitimate within the discourse. And, certainly, I think what we've seen in Alberta over the last, 3 months, 4 months, is that a set of positions about Alberta's place in Confederation have gone from being seen as, sort of the fringe and largely to be dismissed and damaging, to being almost mainstream legitimate positions. And I think that it's not just Danielle Smith who's done that. She's been carrying this water for a while, but the leadership contestants for the UCP who thought that these ideas were damaging enough that they held a press conference in the middle of a leadership campaign, now are in a cabinet that has enacted this legislation. And and then we see other cabinet ministers putting together videos that tell a sort of a selective history of Alberta that are all trying to feed this sense of grievance and alienation. And once you let this stuff out of the box, it doesn't just go back when you want it to, right? It's out.
So, I mean, you talked about sort of the the letting of the stuff out of the box, as you used the United States as an example, and I think that there's some very interesting parallels between Danielle Smith and Donald Trump, not only in regards to their inflammatory style, but even the way that they use their rhetoric. One of Donald Trump's strengths was that he would say both sides of an issue, just in slightly different ways. And so people could pick and choose. Well, they said that Donald Trump's a racist, but there's this picture of him kissing this black baby, so he's clearly not racist because a racist wouldn't do that. So everything's okay. You lefties don't know what you're talking about, woke, crazy people. He was very, very good at staking positions on both sides. And I think we're seeing some of the same things from Smith, where depending on the day, I mean, she had her address to the province where she said, hey, you know what, I've made mistakes, everybody does, we're moving past it. And then just a couple of days later, a reporter asked her, hey, can you give us an example of one of those mistakes? And she basically bit his head off. So if we look at feeding into that polarization as a cautionary tale, why do you think it is that rather than interpreting those historic events, and many other ones I might add, as cautionary tales, there's a lot of people who seem to be using it as an instruction manual?
Well, lots of people go into politics to win, right? And it's a team sport. And I think at a certain point, winning becomes more important for some people than what it is they're winning for. And it's a slippery slope, right? I imagine that there are people who joined the Smith cabinet who knew better, but they told themselves, well, I'll be a moderating force. And, maybe to some extent they are a moderating force, but they're also joining her on the voyage down the slippery slope. And at a certain point, you spend enough time talking to people, you start seeing the world in slightly different ways. I think fundamentally, if we pushed lots of the members of the UCP caucus about why they're going along with her leadership, why they are voting for her legislation that they opposed, mere months ago, they would, the honest answer would be because the election is 5 months away. We can't afford to have another go at picking a leader. And this is better than letting the NDP win. And that might be for their own personal reasons, right? They want to keep their job as an MLA, but it might also be because they, really do believe that the ideas that the NDP stands for are that much more damaging than what Smith stands for. I think they know better, but again, it's a team sport, and people get caught up in their sense of belonging on their side of the aisle, and the sort of the making of the opposition into enemies. And that doesn't have to be the case, right? We can see lots of examples where there's real disagreement between politicians from opposing parties, but an underlying mutual respect. And I worry that we've lost that right now in Alberta.
Yeah, that was you led into my next question beautifully there, because we've certainly seen examples of that from both parties, and there's a lot of people who don't like when that's pointed out, because it is very much a team sport, and if you speak disparagingly about anyone's team, then boy, do they let you know fast. But you say it doesn't have to be the case. What do political parties, do you think, need to do in order to be able to not fall down that rabbit hole of, but the team must win at all costs, get the chainsaws, let's go to work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they have to remind themselves, right? And one of the dilemmas here is that if we look at the composition of the Alberta legislature right now, there's not a lot of political experience there on either side of the aisle, right? There's not people who've been in politics for a long time. Now, Rachel Notley absolutely has, and, Joe Ceci and a few others. And on the UCP side, it's a remarkably new crew, but even, Danielle Smith has been around politics for a long time. But I do think that if we had, some roots, people who could go back to their memories of a different age where there was that sort of respect across the aisle and just some basic norms, that would be a helpful thing. It would be a good reminder. And then, for some of them on both sides of the aisle to actually make an attempt to reach out. And something I told you earlier on that I got so discouraged the first day, I watched Question Period and I just had to turn it off. And then I saw something on Twitter that night that actually was, just what I needed to see. And it was Janice Irwin, who had gone to see the speaker and, was posing with Hansard the cat. And it was just that little bit of humanity that has to exist within the legislature across the aisle, where people can see each other as human beings, but then still, manage to compete against each other on teams. And I think, the reason one of the reasons we're struggling with it right now is that, it is an era of political polarization, and we are in some ways still learning how to be a two-party democracy in Alberta. This is relatively new to us. It was easy to be friendly to the NDP if you didn't think there was any danger that they were going to govern, right, for the UCP. Now it's a different thing, right? They, through the last 4 years, they look at the opinion polls, they look at Rachel Notley and they, look, we've got a problem here. So, I think the day could potentially come, but it's going to take some real effort.
Okay. I'm curious, like you use the team metaphor, the sports metaphor. I'm going to take it a little bit farther and run with it. Even at high level professional sports where the stakes are very high, where things are extremely competitive, people punch each other in the face on a regular basis. I'm going to go with a hockey metaphor here. At the end of those games, both teams line up and they do the good game fist bump, whatever the case may be. Why do you think, it would seem to me a good opportunity for that sort of spirit would have been at the portrait unveiling of Rachel Notley, and instead what we saw was some, I would argue, ugly politicking and utilization of marginalized groups to justify being not a good sport, let's say. What's it going to take, do you think, to get that a little bit of that end of game good game thing going on?
Yeah, I was thinking of that example as well, as I was talking. So I endorse your example. I don't know that we can make them shake hands at the end of Question Period, although that might not be a bad thing. I
think we should make them. I think we should line them up on either side. Everybody shakes everybody's hands.
Works for minor hockey. Why wouldn't it work in the legislature, right?
We can make kids do it.
Exactly. But again, I do hope that as, whatever happens in the 2023 election, I really do hope that both parties can see their way forward to wanting to do politics a little bit differently, and that they can make some efforts to normalize political competition and their ability to have a lively debate and still treat each other like humans. And is it going to happen after the next election? So hard to say, right? There are so many things that are question marks, but I really do hope that I'm going to take a little side journey here, but I think one of the reasons that it's really good that Alberta is part of Canada is that it means that the Canadian political traditions are also Alberta political traditions. We send our politicians to Ottawa to sit in the House of Commons, where there is a more well-established tradition of multi-party cooperation from time to time, some respect across the aisle. And I really do think that, being part of that political tradition saves us from some of what might otherwise happen in Alberta. Certainly, it's kept democracy alive during a period when we've had only one party winning elections. And, I maybe there can be some transfer from the federal level of some of the norms of political competition that we would hope to see.
Can I try paraphrasing what you just said? Maybe there's some good things that Canada has a national government, and we can learn from them.
Yeah. And I know that this isn't going to endear me to a lot of Albertans, but Pierre Trudeau, the first Prime Minister Trudeau, before he was in politics, he was basically a political writer, and he wrote about how important it was for Quebec to be part of Canada, because Quebec could learn things and could be a functional democracy, which it wasn't under Duplessis. It could be a functional democracy by learning from Canada, that Canada had something to offer Quebec that way. And I think about that argument often in the context of Alberta. I think it holds for us as well.
I got a couple other things I want to pick your brain on, if that's okay. Why is Danielle Smith so always wrong about Indigenous people and First Nations people? Because it's getting to be a little bit embarrassing. The display that we saw this week in the legislature, where she equated the oppression of Alberta under Ottawa to what First Nations Indigenous people have had to deal with under the Indian Act, it felt like a new low. I'm thrilled to see that there's an organized effort right now to send all UCP MLAs copies of the book 21 Things You Don't Know About the Indian Act, because clearly there's some things to be learned there. But it's not the first time that we've seen Danielle Smith, I would say, use, when expedient for her, Indigenous and First Nations issues at a time when it feels like a lot of the country is trying to say, oh, we have some healing, perhaps some reconciliation that we need to do.
Yeah. I vehemently agree with everything you just said.
Does she get she's being harmful?
No, I don't think she does.
That's terrifying.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And so, I guess the first thing I would say is that she's demonstrated on a number of occasions a remarkable absence of perspective on questions of oppression, right? So what she said in the legislature this week is a prime example of that. What she said the first day she was sworn in, when she said that the unvaccinated were subject to worse discrimination than anyone else. Again, it's just it's sort of jaw-dropping lack of perspective on the experiences, in particular, of Indigenous people in Canada, right? And it's just no matter what your politics, I think you don't need to read Canadian history particularly deeply to know that this just isn't true, right? So that's the first thing. The second, and I think related thing, is that it's grounded in a sense of victimhood, right? I mean, the common thread between those two statements was that her people, whether it's Albertans within Ottawa or, the vaccine hesitant within mainstream society, have been treated terribly. And I think that she feels that her experience of oppression and victimhood by virtue of being Albertan in Canada and by virtue of being vaccine hesitant in the age of COVID means that she understands the oppression of other groups. And she doesn't, right? Because these are not real moments of oppression. And I think that, you know, what she has done, and this is a common thing that we're seeing on the right in Western Canada, has been to take a very instrumental approach to Indigenous relations. You know, she's got an advisor, you know, who's supposed to be informing her on Indigenous relations. But I think that the purpose of engagement with Indigenous people in this view is to find a way forward for resource development, right? It's to get from here to a goal. And so, you know, Indigenous people are potentially a barrier to that resource development. And so, you know, we'll make friends of them, and then we can have our nice things. And I'm certainly not going to speak for Indigenous people, but I'm not sure that approach is necessarily going to be seen as being particularly authentic by most of the community. But again, I certainly, I'm a settler. That's it. But it also, all of this ignores the history of white supremacy and Western alienation, right? Has the West been treated badly by Ottawa over the years? Yeah, absolutely. You can point to that. Has the West also engaged in a project of oppression and marginalization of Indigenous people, including in pursuit of developing those natural resources? You bet. And there isn't much evidence here of an honest attempt to come to terms with any of that.
Yeah, it seems, I mean, I just can't help but think, and again, I'm as middle-aged white guy as they get, but I can't imagine that the message of, hey, that's some really nice stuff that you've got there, Indigenous folks, so we're going to pretend that we like you in order to get it, is not a message that's going to resonate particularly well. I feel like I could be wrong. But based on the reactions of all of the treaty signatories to the Sovereignty Act, and from there the national body saying, hey, no, I don't know that Smith's approach is necessarily getting the traction that she wants.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, you know, if somebody was serious about really reconstituting Alberta in some way, shape, or form, I think there would have to be an acknowledgement in the first instance of the treaties that are fundamental, and a partnership. The only way this happens without being further oppression is for, you know, the Indigenous people and settlers to walk together in some direction. And none of that happens without an acknowledgement of truth first. And I don't think, you know, I think lots of us have been trying in a variety of ways to come to terms with Canada's history around not treatment of Indigenous people, but the marginalization of Indigenous people, the history of the residential schools. It's hard work. And, you know, I think some of us have taken a few steps. We have a long way to go. I don't see any evidence that Danielle Smith has tried to do that work.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because one of the things that I only just recently learned was that the province of Alberta had a significant hand in some of those residential schools. And so it's not like it's just the feds. No, the government of Alberta was in there too. The victimhood thing is interesting because I think we saw that, and I'd love to get your take on this. I think we saw that highlighted particularly well this last weekend on your province, your premier, where but the straws. Think of the straws, people. Think of the root beer floats. I mean that when somebody's looking at, I don't want to have to use more than one straw as a symbol of federal oppression, like, wow. That's all I've got is just like, wow.
So I think one of the problems that Smith faces with the Sovereignty Act is that it's dealing with a whole bunch of big abstract ideas that are actually hard to communicate. And so, if we're going to give her credit, I would give her credit that she was trying to, bring it home to people who don't follow politics all that closely, that aren't, deeply engaged in questions about, pipeline development or GHG emissions reductions. She was trying to make it concrete, and so, yeah, we all hate that feeling of a paper straw kind of sticking to your lips. I mean, I hate paper straws, don't get me wrong, but I'm not willing to leave Canada over it. So it was, it was her attempt to be a populist, right? She got this far playing the populist card. She was trying to continue it. She's desperately trying to communicate herself as one of the girls, in a sort of a social sense. She does very poorly with women in the polls, and I think she's trying to, communicate that she is just like them, right? And she understands, how much a mom hates a messy paper straw coming apart, right? And it let her remind people that she's a business owner and, small business, all those kinds of things. It was an attempt to make herself relatable. Unfortunately, it was a terrible answer to the constitutional question that she has put on the agenda. So, there we are with the straws.
On the Sovereignty Act, I mean, you had you had a flow chart for that one. And I was reviewing.
I got an F. I gave myself an F.
You were pretty close. If you'd had the amendments part on the upper right hand corner, I think you would have crushed it. But overall, how would you? Let's say one of your students said, "Dr. Young, I have a paper I'd like to write. This is the idea." And they present with you both the original version of the Sovereignty Act with its somewhat dictatorial bent and the finalized version. What grades are you giving each version of the Sovereignty Act?
Well, it really depends on the rubric for the assignment. So
it should be good.
But I guess the question is, what's the purpose of the Sovereignty Act? So if we're grading it as, an attempt to get Ottawa to take Alberta seriously or to accede to Alberta's demands around resource development, then I think both versions of it get an F because they're not going to achieve that objective, right? I mean, the federal government isn't suddenly going to change its climate policy because Alberta is going to, stamp its feet and not enforce the criminal code or something, right? I mean, it doesn't hurt Ottawa, right? Yeah. So if that's the rubric, then it gets an F. If the rubric is, does it save Danielle Smith's leadership of the UCP? Well, then it gets a B plus, right? Because she came into the leadership, having promised two things. She had to back down from one of them, protecting the unvaccinated, because it was too absurd even for the UCP caucus. And so this was all she had left. This is why people got her into office. And she had said it was going to be her Bill 1. It was a concrete promise. And so if she didn't introduce something, she was in a terrible state. So she's done this. She's managed to say to those supporters, yes, I've given you this. They want to believe that it's meaningful, and they've certainly taken to social media to say how fantastic it is that finally we're showing Ottawa that we've had it. So she gets that points for that. I'll bet that she's fundraising off of it right now, and she's got to start raising some money for the party. They've got an election coming, so not half bad. And it let her show herself to be reasonable. And I'm, for those people who are listening to this and not watching, I just did air quotes around reasonable, because in that, she backed away from the piece that was, pushing too far. It let the caucus feel that they were being listened to, and that's been an issue in that caucus. So, as a political compromise, not so bad.
That's a higher grade than I would have given, but I'm not a poli-sci prof, so. Because to me, I mean, it kind of seems like to me what she did was she promised her base, you know what, I'm gonna get you all a car. You're gonna get the best car. It's gonna have wheels and all of the things. And then on the day of the car delivery, they showed up at the well, it would be a Ford dealership, and she handed them a small little dinky toy and said, "See, I did it." I mean, technically, I suppose that you did, and there will be some people that say, "Oh, she did the best that she could under the circumstances," but it's still not what you really promised people. Thank God, but.
She's still leader of the party, right?
Yeah.
She has now crossed the Liz Truss line, right? She's managed to stay in office longer than Liz Truss did. None of us are going out to spend $10 on a head of lettuce to see, who's going to last longer. So this was, if she was going to lose the leadership of the party, if it was all going to fall apart, it was over the Sovereignty Act, right? And she is still leader of the party. There is no, rumbling that we're hearing that she's going to be kicked out. So, that's my measure.
Okay. 2 more questions for you, if you have the time, if that's okay. First one. Danielle Smith has done an incredible job of sucking all of the oxygen out of the room through one of her plastic straws, and one of the things that seems to be going on is with her sucking all of the oxygen out of the room, with her inflammatory comments, her I'm going to say ignorant comments towards Indigenous and First Nations peoples. There's that has been the center of a lot of discussion, unless of course you've just recently moved back to Toronto from Edmonton. That got a lot of conversation too. But what does Rachel Notley have to do between now and May to get some of that oxygen back, do you think?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, and I'm not sure I've got a great answer to it. I guess one thing I would say is, for her Christmas time reading, she should maybe go and read the postmortems of the 2016 presidential election, because I think in some ways she is Hillary Clinton to Danielle Smith's Donald Trump, right? How do you debate somebody who says things that are simply factually inaccurate with enormous self-confidence, right? And I think that's going to be critically important. I think the debate is going to matter. I think that Notley has to keep acting like she's the premier in waiting, and letting Smith sort of go off and do what she would do. But Smith is through the worst stage of her premiership in some ways, right? She can spend the next 3 months handing out goodies, and the trick for Notley is going to be to keep reminding people without making it seem like she's just criticizing Smith all the time, right? She's got to have better ideas. But I guess if there's one piece of advice, I would say read the Twitter thread from last night that David Coletto from Abacus Data put out. And so that was on Tuesday night?
Yeah, December 13th.
Yes. Yeah, December 13th. And I think Abacus is going to have something out on it. But basically what it shows is that if the provincial election is about healthcare, Notley will win. And if the provincial election is about the economy or about Canada's, Alberta's resentment of Canada, it's not a sure thing for Notley at all. And so how do we, how does Notley focus our attention on healthcare over the next number of months and make that the ballot question, as opposed to a question about, who do you think is going to stand up to Ottawa?
Yeah, and it seems like we've already seen in many ways, the UCP election strategy telegraphed, because a certain ex-UCP leadership candidate released a impressively polished video where it really was. I'd love to know how much that video cost, because that was an incredibly well put together piece of political advertising propaganda. Do what you want, but it seems to make it very, very clear that the UCP very much want the election question to be, you're either voting for Danielle Smith or you're voting for Justin Trudeau. And I think it's going to be fascinating to see how Notley and the NDP attempt to counter that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think the one thing that, certainly is in Notley's favor is that there is pretty strong dislike of Danielle Smith and distrust of Danielle Smith. And so, Smith is going to be doing everything in her power for the next 3 or 4 months to put forward a different image. And so, Notley has to walk this really fine line of, on the one hand, reminding people about things that Danielle Smith has said without making it all about Danielle Smith. I mean, I think the NDP made a mistake in 2019, making it all about Jason Kenney and who he was. I'm not sure they could have won anyways, right? The sort of the wave was not headed in their direction, but I do think that was an issue. And so it's tricky times, and I wouldn't want to make a prediction about who's going to win this election. It is not a sure thing for either side.
Well, when you're not willing to throw together a flow chart for the 2023 election, I think that's telling. But I do want to ask, what are you watching for? What's the next flow chart?
I never know when there's going to have to be a flow chart. I just, I wait until events occur or somebody starts demanding it on Twitter.
What's the next big political thing that you're looking for in Alberta? What's the next landmine that you're looking to see Notley not drive over, or Danielle Smith not drive over? What's the next speed bump? I mean, we're heading into the silly season, and it's getting more silly.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to see a period of quiet. I think everyone, and most certainly Danielle Smith, must be exhausted, right? This has been a lot. And so, having some time to step back, regroup, come up with strategy, I think is going to be essential for them. I think that may be a time for Notley to, try and get a message out while the UCP is figuring out what comes next. I think that the spring sitting of the legislature is going to be wild, and it's going to be fascinating to see if Smith goes ahead with this idea of, going and finding instances of federal overreach to use her Sovereignty Act on, or if she comes to her senses and just pretends it didn't happen and, spends her time spending money in Calgary, which is presumably her best bet for winning the election.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see what issues, if any. She seems to have made it clear to her caucus that she wants a laundry list of very bad things that Ottawa has done, maybe or maybe not, um, that she can use. Some people are speculating that she wants that laundry list to supplement the narrative of this next election's about, are you voting for Alberta? That's Danielle Smith, or are you voting for Justin Trudeau, who only wants to take things from you or eat your babies? I don't know.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I think she'll probably give in to that temptation. And on the one hand, it sets a trap for the NDP, because if they vote, against these being instances of overreach, well, then they're in bed with Trudeau. So there's that. On the other hand, if we think about using the Sovereignty Act, it mostly doesn't work, right? And so you're going to have all of these votes in the legislature, and then what? And it, any parent of a toddler knows that if you threaten a consequence, then you need to follow through on it. And she's going to find herself in that situation of, okay, so what's the follow through, right? How are you getting me my plastic straws?
Well, it's going to be interesting because it seems like there's no shortage of litigators and lawyers on the Twitter machine who are salivating at the prospect of this thing being implemented so they can take it for a walk in the courts, because there are still some very present lingering constitutional questions, it seems like. Is there anything else you want people to hear? Anything else you want people to know, people to be watching for?
No, I'll just, I'll use this chance, if they want to take a look at my Substack, it's lisayoung.substack.com.
And you should subscribe to it if you're listening to the podcast, because not only is it incredibly intelligent and insightful, it's also wickedly funny at times. And I personally get excited every time I get an email that says there's a new Substack thing, and then I chase down your Twitter account so we can make sure that we're boosting it properly. But yeah, no, it's an amazing thing you're doing. Dr. Young, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today and sharing all of your perspectives. I really do appreciate it. And I hope it'll be okay if we bother you again in the future.
Happy to. This was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, we would love it if you swung by our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab and signed up for a small monthly sponsorship of the work that we're trying to do here. It is because of the support that we receive from our Patreon sponsors that we're able to continually up our game, and it is tremendously appreciated. So I want to throw a big thank you out to them, and you can go ahead and visit that website and join and support us as well, because we need all the help we can get. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for listening and being part of these important conversations. And we will see you next time on The Breakdown.